This is wrestling's greatest moments.
Hey now, wrestling fans. Wrestling fans who grew up in the 70s and 80s remember wrestling magazines like Inside Wrestling, Sports Review Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and others that became known as the Apter Mags. The magazines did it all, helping fans keep up on the top wrestlers and promotions from around the world, providing some action-packed photos from various promotions, offering interviews, both real and fake, and delivering some completely kooky kayfabe stories. Sit back as wrestling's greatest moments looks at those awesome Apter magazines. But before we get started though, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. What were the Apter magazines? Long before the internet, wrestling fans had few options for keeping up on wrestling outside their local promotion. While there were newsletters, most fans were unaware of them. Instead, fans had to pick up wrestling magazines to read the latest news. While there have been many wrestling magazines, one of the more popular publications fell under the banner of Stanley Weston Publications. However, for many fans, they're better known as the Apter Mags due to editor Bill Apter's heavy involvement with them. The magazines were a good way for fans to keep up on the major happenings in the wrestling world. They featured articles covering many of the promotions in the United States and Canada, focusing on NWA territories, the WWF, and the AWA. The publications covered major feuds and title changes, and while the news was usually 2 or 3 months behind, fans could keep up on promotions outside where they lived. Cable television was in its infancy, so fans rarely had access to wrestling outside the territory operating from where they lived. Covering wrestling through a kayfabe lens. The Apter magazines were published largely when kayfabe was king, which meant that they protected kayfabe and reported on pro wrestling stories as if everything was real, ranging from kayfabe rivalries to kayfabe injuries. The magazines maintained this approach for years and created their own terminology for describing wrestlers and their world. For example, babyfaces were scientific wrestlers, while heels were rule breakers. At times, things could be confusing. For example, Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling was correctly labeled Mid-South in the magazines, but for some reason, the Memphis-based Continental Wrestling Association was described as Mid-Southern. However, the various magazines' writers weren't afraid to fill in backstories, such as explaining why a scientific wrestler suddenly turned into a rule breaker when they jumped from one promotion to another. They also added depth, sometimes unnecessary, to storylines, such as describing championship wrestling from Florida wrestler Kevin Sullivan as satanic during his occult-based storyline. Sullivan never referred to himself as such, but the Apter magazines gave this impression, which actually made some fans think Sullivan portrayed himself as a devil worshipper. Some fine features. Fans have many memories of the Apter magazines, including their many monthly features. These include monthly interviews and columns by different personalities, including the always controversial heel columns from Dan Shockett and later Eddie Elner. Here are just a few of the columns and features that made the magazine so memorable. The Scouting Report featured capsule analyses of different wrestlers, sometimes from a particular territory. Things such as height and weight, years as a pro, and current rankings were included, as were breakdowns of wrestlers' strengths and weaknesses, and predictions for what was next for their careers in the upcoming months. Some of the comments were funny, such as this breakdown of one of Gentleman Chris Adams' weaknesses. Small head, boasting a hat size of just 6 3/4. Adams is too easily the victim of the Von Erich claw hold. The top 10 columns covered a surprising number of territories, giving fans an idea of who was in the hunt for titles, who was over with the fans, and who was the most hated. According to Bill Apter, he called different promotions to get an idea of who a promotion's top stars were. Promoters sometimes gave him an idea of which wrestlers might be in line for a push down the road, since promoters knew the magazines didn't make it to the newsstands until months after they were written. There was also Pro Wrestling Illustrated's monthly color centerfold. Now this was long before the Divas era, so fans saw their favorite male wrestlers. The centerfolds were a full-color photo of different wrestlers, which were great for fans who wanted to pin them up. They also featured a fairly in-depth kayfabe profile on the wrestler and a page that covered things such as favorite maneuver, greatest match, most hated opponent, and toughest opponent. For example, an up-close feature on Kevin Von Erich has him describe his most hated opponent. I hate the Freebirds. I don't even like to say I dislike anyone, but I hate them, especially Michael Hayes. The man never shuts up. I don't approve of anything they do in the ring or outside of it. Other monthly features included the thumbs up and thumbs down columns, which praised or criticized wrestlers for their actions. For example, one issue gave Hulk Hogan a thumbs up for his significant role in the box office smash hit Rocky. This has captured the hearts of wrestling fans everywhere. It's even exposed people to wrestling who've never been fans of the sport before, creating many new fans, including Johnny Carson, who recently had Hogan on as a guest on The Tonight Show. However, Tommy Rich received a thumbs down for, although he has suffered greatly at the hands of Roddy Piper, having sustained a serious hand injury requiring the wearing of a heavy cast on his arm, Rich has insisted on wrestling with the cast. This offers him an unfair advantage in his matches that his opponents can never hope to equal. Another was the X-Ray, which featured a panel of wrestling legends examining a wrestler's career or recent career move. In one instance, wrestlers including Bruno Sammartino, Vern Gagne, Gene Kiniski, Johnny Valentine, Lou Thez, and Eddie Graham briefly discussed AWA star Jerry Blackwell, whose contract had been sold to foreign heel Sheikh Adnan Al-Kaisi. Here's what Eddie Graham supposedly had to say. It would be very easy to find fault with Jerry, because he's tied himself together with this sheik from the Middle East. He's built in the mold of Haystacks Calhoun, and all the rest of the common criticisms you hear about Blackwell. The thing is, though, he's successful at what he does, and I learned early in life that you can't argue with success. Another feature was What They Are Saying, which featured wrestlers' most revealing quotes. Here's one from Captain Lou Albano. Listen here, Daddy. I've got me a new tag team, the British Bulldogs, and I just want to say that they've never been intimidated, never duplicated, and they're going to be my next pair of tag team champions, Daddy, because they have the talent, the skill, the ability, the skill and the talent to do the job on Brutus Beefcake and Greg Valentine, and they will do the job, Daddy. They will do the job. Correspondent reports also filled fans in on outside promotions. The wrestler featured a report from Bob Miller in Temple, Texas. As a featured attraction at the Civic Center, 10 stars of Southwest Championship Wrestling participated in a Texas brawl. In this event, the last wrestler standing was declared the winner and awarded a check for $5,000. Foreign objects and taped fists were legal, and there were no disqualifications. The Apter Mags later experimented with a weekly version of Pro Wrestling Illustrated that focused on providing more recent results. However, the subsequent spread of the internet decreased interest in the weekly publication, and it was scrapped. An eclectic mix of real and fictitious personalities. The Apter Mags appeared to have a large staff, but given the magazine's reputation for playing fast and loose with the facts, were any of their columnists besides Bill Apter real? According to Bill, there were several staff members, including Stu Sachs, Peter King, Craig Peters, Dan Shockett, and Eddie Elner. Grizzled veteran reporter Matt Brock and Liz Hunter, the lowest lane of wrestling journalism, provided interesting stories, but were figments of the magazine's various writers' imaginations. Brock's columns usually featured him reflecting on the good old days of wrestling, sometimes revisiting historic matches, and at other times comparing current stars to yesterday's heroes and villains. Liz Hunter supposedly provided a woman's perspective on wrestling, adding another voice, albeit a manufactured one, to the magazines. The different writers created engaging content, which is all the more impressive, as fans didn't pick up the magazines for instant news like they would with a newspaper or weekly magazines like Time or Newsweek. Instead, they garnered a general idea of what was going on in wrestling, but more importantly, who the different wrestlers were competing around the world and their motivations, whether it was greed, a desire for revenge, or championship gold. However, nothing could compare to the heel writing of Dan Shockett and Eddie Elner. Shockett was a rarity in wrestling at the time, as he took the heel side, which naturally infuriated readers. Here's an excerpt from a column where Shockett discusses Tommy Rich's brief flirtation with playing a heel and quick return to the babyface side. I suppose people who like wimps instead of wrestlers are happy. His thousands of fans are celebrating. The good old boy from the South is one of theirs again. He'll once again make the sport safe for cowards, corrupt officials, and mediocrities. Shockett got under the skin of wrestlers. According to Bill Apter, Much of Danny's heel persona was actually culled from his true personality. Dan was one of the most sarcastic people I had ever known. He had a natural ability to rile you up if he thought you were at all vulnerable. Dangerous Dan. Dangerous to poor Bill Apter, because some wrestlers believed it was a pseudonym Apter wrote under, was known for his pet names for wrestlers. Worm Slime was a term of endearment Shockett used for Rich, which angered Wildfire. That was just one start. When David Von Erich died, Bill Apter found himself in the hot seat when he learned David's dad Fritz was none too pleased with comments by Shockett, comments attributed to Apter. Even worse, the article was written before David's death, but published afterwards. Apter recalls manager and booker Gary Hart, who Apter was friends with, confronting. One of the names you write under, Dan Shockett, wrote a story comparing David, Kerry, and Kevin to Moe, Larry, and Curly, the Three Stooges. How could you do that, my man? While Bill was usually able to pacify people, many still refused to believe that Shockett and Lady Eddie Elner weren't actually pen names. Eddie Elner took over for Shockett after Dan died in his mid-30s in 1985, continuing to provide a voice for rule breakers. PWI Year End Awards. Another popular feature was PWI's Year End Awards, as voted on by the fans. Awards included Feud of the Year, Wrestler of the Year, Woman of the Year, a step up from Girl Wrestler of the Year, Rookie of the Year, Most Inspirational Wrestler of the Year, Most Improved Wrestler, and others, including the Stanley Weston Award for Lifetime Achievement, originally named the PWI Editors Award. We'll post a link in the Works reference section if you want to peruse the various awards. Given the magazine's original focus on kayfabe and the writer's habit of embellishing stories, just how legit were these awards? Former PWI editor Stu Stacks revealed in an interview with Kayfabe Memories that everything was above board. Every letter is opened, every vote is counted. The winners are selected by the readers. The vote totals were proportionally inflated, I confess. Now we present the totals as percentages, rather than actual numbers. While the actual number of votes was inflated, it appears the actual results were legitimate. The scandal of apartment wrestling. For many years, Apter had to deal with a scandal of apartment wrestling, a regular feature in sports review wrestling. The feature profiled scantily clad women battling it out in apartments, and while the photos are tame by today's standards, some consider them risque during their heyday. According to Bill Apter, the magazine's owner, Stanley Weston featured apartment wrestling in an attempt to boost the magazine's sales. Bill Apter was opposed to it. As he recalls, he opposed the idea as he sensed it would cause controversy with some wrestlers. In fact, it did. As was his custom, Apter brought copies of the latest wrestling magazines when he visited wrestlers backstage. Several wrestlers were unhappy with seeing themselves on the magazine cover next to a photo featuring apartment wrestling. Here are some of the reactions. Dominic DiNucci. Billy, don't put my picture in a magazine with naked girls. I don't like that. It doesn't go in a wrestling magazine, that stuff. Chief J. Strongbow. I can't take this home. Thanks for putting me on the cover, but please, no more sharing the cover with the girls. If you keep doing this, just don't bring me a copy. I don't want to see it. According to Bill, things only got worse. The nail went into the coffin when Gorilla Monsoon, who was the agent for the show, picked it up, tossed it across the room and said, "You can tell Weston this doesn't fly." Like many aspects of the magazines, Apter was credited with everything, including taking the apartment wrestling photos. While Bill admits he shot one apartment wrestling photo session, he claims other people were involved. As far as Apter is concerned, apartment wrestling's best team was writer Dan Shockett and photographer Theo Errett. Dan created most of the storylines, and his alter ego was millionaire playboy apartment wrestling impresario Dave Mole. Bill writes in his biography that Shockett, who died in 1985 at a young age, also wrote for a men's magazine. Unfortunately for Bill, the magazine that featured apartment wrestling saw its sales improve, which made the feature a permanent one for several years. While it proved popular with its readers, it continued to cause headaches for Bill when he stopped by the local arenas. Thankfully for Bill, the feature was eventually scrapped. Apter writes in his memoir that he's unsure if the sales declined or if publisher Stanley Weston was tired of wrestlers and promoters kvetching about the feature. For apartment wrestling connoisseurs, Theo Errett's book, Exquisite Mayhem, Apartment Wrestling, may be up your alley. The time factor. Although the Apter Mags were a great resource before the internet, the time between when the magazines were compiled and when they made it to the newsstand meant fans were getting stone-cold old news. Nonetheless, the powers that be did their best to work around this. According to Stu Sachs, yes, the time lag between production and the actual on-sale date presents a huge challenge for us both in wrestling and boxing. We try to make the articles as timeless as possible, directing our readers' attention to what might happen in the future, rather than what will be 2 months old by the time they get their issue. That lag period is just the nature of the beast. In his memoir, Bill Apter notes, due to the magazine publishing lag, it took a few months from the time we all submitted our respective parts to when the magazine appeared on the newsstands. The time lag could upset fans and wrestlers who questioned why things seemed outdated. Apter recalls one phone call. Once I received a call from a high-ranking member of the National Wrestling Alliance. I don't remember who it was now, 30 years later. He was that we had the former world champion still listed as a current world champion. I had to explain about the publishing lag time to newsstands, but that still didn't appease him. Make sure it's changed in the next issue, he said very sternly. If not, we could take your photo credential privileges away. Just another one of the headaches Bill Apter experienced as the face of Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Inside Wrestling, and the various other magazines he edited. Stories designed to sell magazines. While wrestling is known for its larger-than-life storylines, that didn't stop Bill Apter and his fellow writers from crafting a good story. As mentioned earlier, the magazine's owner, Stanley Weston, wanted to move magazines, not soothe wrestlers' egos. Consequently, writers spun some yarns that would make some of Hulk Hogan's tall tales believable. Perhaps the best example is the Greg Valentine robot story. The Greg Valentine robot. Greg the Hammer Valentine was one of the toughest men from the 70s and 80s, but apparently his WWF manager, the Grand Wizard, was looking for something even more. The issue of Inside Wrestling had its scoop of the month, and what a scoop it was. According to wrestling journalist Stephen Farhood, in a diabolical scheme that could change the very face of wrestling, rule-breaker manager the Grand Wizard has employed a scientist from New Mexico to create a lifelike robot in the form of Greg Valentine. The robot, called an automaton, was believed to have wrestled and defeated prelim grappler Steve King in a recent match. The article includes several quotes from Dr. Sam Ramsbush, one of the most noted biogenetic synthesists in the United States. Dr. Ramsbush commented on how expensive such a robot would cost, but warned, this wizard could do much harm with such a creation. Should these magazines be called the Apter Mags? Although Bill Apter played a huge role in the magazines nicknamed the Apter Mags, many people were involved in the various magazines' production. Former editor Stu Sachs once remarked, "Allow me to rant here for a pet peeve of mine, the constant reference to our magazines as the Apter Mags. I love Bill and have the greatest admiration for him and what he brought to this company. He was trusted within an industry that was understandably very guarded. He was our front man, for sure, but he was not the only man. He was part of a team. Again, taking nothing away from Bill, because he's earned everything he ever got in this business. It bugs me to see the contributions of so many people reduced to a handy label, Apter Mags. How about Weston Mags? There wouldn't have been a Bill without a Stanley." Nonetheless, Bill Apter was the face of the various wrestling magazines for decades. Apter appeared at ringside and backstage to take pictures. He was later joined on occasion by others, which put him in the spotlight. He appeared on wrestling TV programs to hand out PWI Awards. Longtime fans may remember him hosting his Scouting Report series in Jim Crockett Promotions, where he interviewed different wrestlers. Stanley Weston sold his magazine business in 1993. Bill Apter remained there, that is, until newcomer WOW magazine courted him, not only offering him a 3-year contract, a $20,000 increase in pay, and a $25,000 signing bonus. Apter signed with WOW in 1999, leaving the so-called Apter Mags behind. Since then, the magazine industry has changed dramatically, and while many of the magazines Bill Apter was involved with are no longer published, Pro Wrestling Illustrated continues. Its PWI 500 is one of the most anticipated issues every year, as industry professionals are interested in seeing where they rank among their peers. Do you remember the Apter Mags? Do you have any other favorites? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and let us know if there are any videos you'd like wrestling's greatest moments to cover. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel, follow us on X and Instagram, and spread the good news about wrestling's greatest moments, the channel that celebrates the squared circle.